This afternoon, I'd like to invite a speaker up that's is the assistant professor of sociology at the University of Waterloo and an author with Joel Thiessen, who is professor of sociology at Ambrose University. And together they've published a forthcoming book called None of the Above, Having No Religion in Canada and the U.S. So I'd like to introduce to you Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme.
Thank Brian, John, Doug, the organizers of the event, for inviting me and for putting this together. It's been great. It's my first time at the Canadian Church Press Conference, so it's been a great experience so far. Thanks. And so, yeah, here we go. Here's my thing. There we go. I'll introduce myself. There we go. Yeah, like Brian said, I'm a prof at the University of Waterloo. Been there since 2015, so that's 4 years now. And my interest, I really like studying religion through its numbers in Canada. So less kind of the content of religion, theology, and more how religion is lived by individuals and how it interacts with other aspects of social life, trends in the social, religious, spiritual landscape in the country. Also how it plays with things like, political activity, civic engagement, attitudes towards issues, social issues, towards minority groups, and so forth. So that's kind of my study. I've been doing that for the past 10 years or so. And I use a lot of statistical data. So if you don't like numbers, I'm sorry. I have some bad news for you today. There's going to be a lot of numbers, but I will make it hopefully exciting for you. And, I'm going to go through the ideas to kind of give you guys information about what the current day religious, spiritual, non-religious landscape looks like in Canada, a bit where we've come from, mostly about the current situation, and maybe a few ideas of where we might be headed in the years to come. So I work on a number of research projects looking at religion in Canadian society. I've kind of got a list up here. So I've got the book with Joel that we've finished. Yes, it's in production with New York University Press. I don't know what it's like you guys publishing, but we have the whole peer review process as well, so it takes extra long. It's good, we get feedback, but it takes extra long. So that's done. Joel sends his hellos, by the way. He couldn't make it today. He's at another event out west somewhere. Joel has a crazy speaking schedule. But anyway, so we've worked on this together. We're particularly proud of it, looking at people who say they have no religion in North America, in Canada, and the US. So a lot of what I'm going to present to you today is from that book, but I'm also going to draw on a few other projects I'm involved with. I'm working with Martin and the gang, looking at the kind of Catholic context, especially in French-speaking Canada, but also across the country. What does lived Catholicism look like now? Where are we going with a kind of more cultural form of Catholicism in Quebec, and so forth. So we'll have a little bit of info from that today. I've got some interview data today. I won't all be numbers. There'll be some testimonies, some experiences from individuals that comes from this third project down here, this one. This is a project that's led by Paul Bramadat out west at the University of Victoria, who I work with a lot. And this is a project where we're collecting data. I ran a survey. He did a bunch of focus groups and interviews in the kind of Cascadian Pacific Northwest region, so BC and the states of Washington and Oregon, and be like, okay, in an area where half the population says they have no religion, what does the landscape look like? What does that mean for society? And it might have implications for where we're headed in the rest of North America. And then finally, I've got my own survey that I just finished running, just got the data last week, so I'm cleaning it and crunching it now. I'm always happy doing this. Called the Millennial Trend Survey. I don't have results from that today. It's a bit too early, but the results will be up on Twitter, so stay tuned. If you want to follow me on Twitter, I'll post stuff about once a week, just kind of graphs, charts from that survey data. Okay. So the goal of today is really to kind of give you a sense of what's going on, and especially from the view that the numbers give us, from kind of information, data that I've gathered from individuals over the last few years, or that other agencies like Statistics Canada has gathered on religion over the last few years. But before I get to that, let's go back to that survey that I got you guys to fill out. I don't know if there's going to be feedback or not if I stand over here, but I asked you in that survey, what percentage did you think of Manitobans, so we're here in Winnipeg, beautiful Winnipeg, If you ask them, like StatsCan does, once a year in their big survey, general social survey, they ask about 20 to 25,000 Canadians a number of questions in that survey, but one of their questions that usually comes back is, what, if any, is your religion? So what we call the religious affiliation question, right? What religion, regardless if you're actually practicing or not, what religion do you identify with? And so I ask you guys, so what percentage do you think, how many in Manitoba, what percentage say they're Christian? So it looks like the answer that got the most votes was 40 to 64%. I'm sorry to say, guys, you're wrong. The actual correct answer, 3 of you got, is when you ask people, there's actually a high percentage. I've got the exact percentage here, give me a sec. It's 69% in Manitoba. 69% of people, that's our estimate, and it's a pretty good estimate, it comes from a decent survey that StatsCan runs, will say that they're some form of Christian, so Catholic, some Christian denomination, sometimes just a generic Christian as well. 69%, that's pretty close to the national average. I think the national average in 2016 is around 68%. And that percentage, we'll see a bit later, it's a bit lower out west, so in BC it's quite a bit lower, and this is pretty good. It's a little bit higher in Atlantic Canada across the country. All right. So the other question I asked, I don't know if you guys saw it, there was a second question to this survey. Uh-oh, okay. No one answered this one. Oh no, okay. Didn't see it. Okay, that's okay. Let's do it voiceover. So the second question was, what percentage of Manitobans say they attend a religious service of any faith tradition at least once a month, right? So there's lots of people who say they identify as with some form of Christian tradition, group, or affiliation. Okay, you guys filling it out. You can also just shout it out if you like. 30%. We have something else? Another number going? No? You all agree with 30%. That's what you think it's going to be. 15. So this is once a month, at least once a month. Not once a week, once a month. 15, got another going? 20. 20, anyone else? Anyone else? I think this one you guys got a bit closer to. It's 35% in Manitoba. Say they attend a religious service at least once a week. This is from 2015. Yeah, once a month. Sorry, so the question was asked in 2015 and was on average in the past year, how often have you attended? And 35% said at least once a month. That's pretty good for Manitoba. That's one of the higher rates in the country. The national average is 26% across all of Canada. It's very low in Quebec. So Quebec's that peculiar case where almost everyone says they're Catholic, almost no one goes to church. You're looking probably maybe some parts of Atlantic Canada have a slightly higher rate than this, but this is pretty good. This is one of the higher spots in the country for kind of what I call regular religious service attendance. We can have this discussion, is at least once a month regular or not, but I kind of always go with the once a month rather than once a week because, some people, they have other demands on their time, like, well, maybe not quite once a week, but at least once a month. This is, by looking at the population, this is usually who I consider kind of more the actively religious population in the country. So pretty good, guys. Not bad. All right, I'll switch back to my slides, and then we'll get going. I just kind of wanted to give you guys a little interactive thing to start off with. By the way, I don't know how much you guys speak with other groups, but if ever you wanted to, that Mentimeter real-time survey, it's free to use. You can just go and sign up, create your own little survey, and it's a kind of fun way to hear back from people, get feedback. Okay, so let's start off by looking at some of the kind of key numbers I've got about religion in Canada in general. All right, those were the Manitoba numbers. Let's look at the national numbers overall. So this is from the 2011 National Household Survey. This is the last time that StatsCan asked a big chunk of the Canadian population what religion they identify with. So this replaced the long-form census in 2011, so asked about roughly 20% of households their religious affiliation. Next time they're going to do that is going to be in 2021. And this is what we get. So across the country, we've got about almost 40% Catholic, identify, say they're Catholic. Another 28% is, I kind of put the other Christian groups together, so you got Protestants in there that make a big chunk of that. You've also got some other groups like Church of Latter-day Saints, Jehovah's Witnesses. You also have some of the Orthodox churches, or the Orthodox churches, in that other Christian category. Islam's at 3%, a bit higher in Ontario and Quebec, a bit lower elsewhere in the country. Other religions, so all other pretty much non-Christian religions, form 6% in 2011, and then you have almost a quarter of the population who says they have no religion. So this black slice here, if you will, is who I'm referring to when I speak about religious nuns of the N-O-N-E variety. So people who say they have no religion. And we'll get into who they look like, who they are, some of their beliefs, some of their practices, what that looks like when you kind of scratch at that identity. All right. So that's identity. How has that changed? I put since 1985 here on this slide. By the way, if again, this is lots of information. Hopefully you can see most of this, but at least I'll say the important bits on these graphs for those of you in the back for whom it's probably quite small. And if anyone wants these slides, I'm happy to send them, so come see me after. I'll get your email and I'll just shoot you the slides so that if you want these numbers, you can have them for the future. So you don't have to furiously write them down if you're interested in them. So in green is the rates in 1985. That was the first time StatsCan ran their big general social survey. And then in orange is 2016, the last data I had access to before this presentation. And so it's kind of looking at how many people in those two surveys said they had no religion, were of some form of Christian identity, or were of a non-Christian identity. And you can see here by the arrows that no religion group has gone up quite a bit. In 1985, it was 11%. We usually consider the 1970s as the start of that increase. Usually in 1971, it was about 4% of the population. That's usually when we date that start of the kind of no religion boom, if you like, in the country. Christian affiliations as a share of the population has gone down since 1985. Probably less than you were expecting, some of you, but still has gone down over the few decades, over 3 decades that we're looking at. And then the non-Christian groups have stayed relatively stable. Obviously, the composition of those non-Christian groups have shifted, especially with non-Western immigration, especially since the 1990s. But as an overall share of the population, it's been pretty stable since 1985. It's up since the 1960s, though, but pretty stable since the 80s. Okay. We're good? By the way, if ever you need any kind of quick clarifications to understand anything in the graph, don't hesitate to stop. I'm happy to answer those quick questions, and then we'll have time at the end of the talk for kind of more substantive questions about what I'm showing you guys. Okay, so that's kind of identity changes over the years. In this graph here, it's from data from 2015. This is kind of giving you a sense of, okay, if we add the kind of practice dimension into it, right? The kind of percentage of people who attend religious services or not, what does that look like in 2015? So I kind of broke them down into 3 main groups I use quite a bit. So I've got that 24% who say they have no religion, no religious affiliation. You've got your 50% of who I call marginal affiliates, so who identify with a religious tradition of any kind, I group them all together, but who don't attend religious services all that often, so less than once a month. That's who I identify as those kind of marginal affiliates. So that's your kind of big chunk of the Canadian population still. And then you got about 26% who I call the active affiliates, who are identifying with a religion and attending religious services at least once a month. So you got about kind of this big half marginal affiliates, and then about a quarter on each side of no religion and of active affiliates. How has that changed since the 1980s? We saw this earlier, no religion's gone up since 1985. Marginal affiliates have stayed pretty stable, a little bit of an increase, but pretty stable. And then it's mainly the active affiliates as a proportion of the population that have gone down since the 1980s. And obviously, this group has also changed in composition too, and I'll talk about that in a moment, kind of more non-Western immigration. They're kind of feeding that active affiliate group, and so the dynamics of those groups internally are changing as well. Okay. Well, this is that slide. So this is, again, those three categories: active affiliates, marginal affiliates, no religious affiliation. This is from 2015, so data from 2015. And in blue is the percentage of those who are born outside of Canada in each of the three categories. So for example, 39% of those who are born outside of the country, that should be probably CD anyways, 39% are active affiliates. So there's a lot more of those who are born outside the country who are actively involved in religious groups. You still have about a fifth of the population who's born in Canada who are active affiliates, 21%. That population is quite a bit older on average, but still there. And you still do find some, obviously, amongst millennials. 43% of those born outside of Canada are marginal affiliates, compared to about 54%, yeah. And then only 17% of those born outside of Canada say they have no religion. This is coming usually especially from Europe, but also, yeah, sometimes other non-Western countries, but mainly especially from European countries, compared to about a quarter of those born in Canada who say they have no religion. One of the kind of realities of, Canada is still an immigration country, always kind of has been since European settlers arrived, and so we're kind of active religiosity in the country is being fed especially by that non-Western immigration, something I'm sure you're all aware of, but it's good to see the numbers sometimes. It's becoming a reality for more and more faith groups in the country. Another thing to point out here is the youth question, or the generational divide between these different categories that I'm working with. So light pink is younger people. Darker red here is kind of older individuals, again, breaking down by these three: no religion, marginal affiliates, active affiliates categories. You can see, for example, those between the ages of 15 and 34 years old in 2015, about a third said they had no religion, compared to only 8% amongst the older respondents. Marginal affiliates seem to be especially popular amongst kind of the middle-aged adults, so Gen X boomers. Right? So over half of those two age groups, 35 to 74-year-olds, are marginal affiliates in the country. And then active affiliates, especially popular amongst the 75 years or older group. Yeah. So I'll come back to this. Tend to consider this more of a generational phenomenon than a life cycle phenomenon. So there's kind of two ways to interpret this. It's like, when people are younger, they're less religious, then they might get religious when they're older. I won't present a huge amount of data on that today, I don't want to drown you in, but what we're noticing is that actually this 15 to 34-year-old group is much less religious today than it was in the 1980s. And so we understand it, I understand it, Joel understands it, a number of scholars understand it, more as a more permanent generational shift that's going on in the country. And mentioned this quickly earlier on, but what I've presented to you so far has been national averages. There's quite a bit of regional variation in the country. This is, for example, the rates of no religion, those who say they have no religion in Canada. And you see that national average of 23-24%, especially Ontario, which is usually the case. Ontario has more demographic weight, so it usually impacts the national averages a lot more. But those rates are much higher if you go out west. Thus, the reason why some of us are studying the Pacific Northwest. It's a kind of distinct context in that sense. So BC, 44% of the population in that long-form census or National Household Survey in 2011 said they had no religion. Amongst younger adults, that's way high. It's over the 50% mark in BC. Whereas, for example, in Quebec, the rate's quite low, not because people are super religious in Quebec, but because a lot of people still identify as Catholic, even though virtually none of them go to church or have any contact with the Catholic Church. Atlantic Canada is kind of the spot in Canada where organized religion is still doing relatively well. Only 16%, it's the lowest in Newfoundland and Labrador, I think. And then kind of as you move west, that rate of no religion kind of goes up. And the Northern Territories, the rate is relatively high too, at 31%. And we'll talk about kind of different types of non-religion, right? There's kind of different ways to be a religious nun, and we'll talk about that in a bit. Okay, so everyone kind of get those graphs so far? Any kind of quick questions to understand any of the stuff you're still not sure about? Everyone got it? All right, how are we doing for time? Yeah, we're doing good for time, all right. So these numbers, there's different ways to understand them. This is where the debate happens in the academic world. I don't know how exciting that is, but it happens. In the fields of sociology of religion and religious studies, most agree that organized religion indicators are on the decline. In Canada, yes, also in the US, and more advanced in a lot of European countries as well. However, there's different ways to interpret those numbers. And so I want to talk a few minutes with you about some of those ways that different scholars, different thinkers are understanding these trends that I just presented to you. Give me a sec. This is where I'm going to refer to the notes. See, I always remember the numbers by heart, but I always need the notes for the actual substantive issues. So these are, and you'll notice, like these theoretical frameworks are tools that we as sociologists or scholars use, but they're often not terms that you find amongst individuals themselves. This is kind of, once we gather the data from individuals, this is how we kind of frame that. This is our role as the kind of middle person, the researcher between what's the empirical data in the field and then kind of presenting it as, okay, this is how we understand it. And there's kind of three main ways these days to understand those numbers. So I thought I'd present them each to you. I'm not someone who's like, this one's right and the rest are wrong, it's awful. Each of these frameworks have strengths and weaknesses, in my opinion. There's one or two that I feel have more strengths than the other. But that being said, I think they each kind of bring something to the table, and you'll probably maybe see yourselves, your own views of what's going on reflected in maybe one or a couple of these frameworks. So the first one is this, what we call supply-side market theories. So these are theories, kind of big thinkers in the US that have developed this in their books and their research articles. Rodney Stark, Roger Finke. Here in Canada, Reg Beebe is, especially in recent years, is a big proponent of these supply-side market theories. And so these researchers argue that the demand for spiritual products in Canada and in the US, and everywhere basically, remains amongst the population. The demand hasn't gone away. Yes, there is decline of indicators, but what people still, according to this framework, still have these spiritual needs that they need to fulfill. It's actually the fault of the churches that it's not working. It's the supply, I call it here the oligarchy, the big kind of Canadian churches in the kind of second half of the 20th century and still today, according to this framework, aren't innovating enough to offer the religious and spiritual products that Canadians want and need today. So you get decline of religion in the country, but it's seen mainly as the result of kind of like a consumer frustration of sorts, right? Like people need something, but it's like, it's not being offered, so I'm not going for it. And because that's the way they understand what's going on, it also impacts how they see potential, how the future might play out. Because this framework, the supply-side framework, argues that a large-scale religious revival is possible in the very near future, right? Like people are just waiting to go back. And it's up to the churches and to religious groups to step up and offer what people want, and then people will just like flood back, will come back. I'm exaggerating, I only got a few minutes to present this. It's obviously a much more complex framework, but this is kind of the main idea of what these people kind of see of what's happening in the current context. So that's one way of viewing what's going on. And in the Q&A, we can come back to any of these and all of these if you want. The second way I'll call nuanced secularization theories, or stages of decline, if you will. So classic secularization theories are like, okay, religion is kind of what I illustrate here. It's like, religion, right? It's like, it's dying, it's going to disappear, it's gone, it's no longer relevant, etc. So that's like a classic secularization theory. However, there's not a whole lot of tenets of that classic version today. What you do find, and I'm probably more in that second category, is a more nuanced version of that theory. So this theory kind of argues that, the decline of religiosity indicators, the indicators we saw in the previous slides, is understood here as a consequence of long-standing, progressive, and generational religious decline over time, driven by changing socialization patterns and social environments among an important segment of the Canadian population. Don't worry, I'll elaborate on this. Many members of older generations initially diminished their religiosity, notably around the mid-20th century in central Canada, by gradually dropping their church attendance and religious group activities once prevalent during their childhood. right? It's a fancy way or a nicer way of saying what a lot of you have seen and might have even experienced. Religious identification, however, and occasional involvement with a religious group persisted amongst that group that initially left church, but they still identified with a religion, still might go back for things like Easter, for Christmas services, to baptize their kids or their grandkids, maybe to get married, to have a funeral. And they maintained their social and cultural ties to their faith tradition and experienced remaining normative expectations surrounding religion. Right? So they kept their identity, maybe because they wanted to, or they felt a certain amount of social pressure still coming from their kind of background where they grew up, to still identify as having a specific religion. However, when these, especially members of the boomer generation, went through this, was kind of that transition group, when these boomers had their children, so had children of their own, more of these children were raised without any kind of explicit religious socialization. So they didn't attend religious services regularly with their parents or receive regular religious education at school or at home. It depends where you were in the country, but they grew up in a much more kind of what we call secular childhood background, social environment than their parents did. This, in turn, has driven larger numbers of members of younger generations to not see the need to have any ties, including identity ties, with religion, right? So more say they have no religion. They're like, listen, I didn't grow up in it. I have no use. I don't see the relevance of it anymore. I don't need any of it. So in this framework, the second secularization, nuanced secularization framework, stages of decline, the demand for religious and spiritual goods is not seen as a fundamental need found among all humans across time and cultures. In the supply side model, everyone has this need for spirituality. And it's up to the groups to offer to fill that need. It takes a certain cultural form, but is still there. In the second framework, it's like, no. That need can be there, but it's a socially constructed need. You're raised and trained to have that need, and if you are, you have it. But if you grow up in a more secular environment, you don't learn it in that way. It's socially constructed in a given time and place, and that we currently find ourselves in a time and place where this need has not been learnt or constructed among an important portion of the population. Not amongst everyone, but among a sizable chunk of the Canadian population. And so according to the stages of decline framework, a large-scale religious revival is not imminent, right? Not everyone's just kind of waiting to go back. Regardless of what the religious groups do with their supply, because it would take a much larger structural change of our society to bring back interest in religion, a change away from our current de-traditionalized, globalized, individualized societies. Right? So this is a kind of different understanding. Same data, but different understanding of what's going on. Social change in this framework can happen, but it's probably going to take a bigger shift, a more structural shift of how we live our lives, rather than just churches changing what they offer, to affect individuals. Because a lot of these individuals are completely disconnected from religious groups, have no idea what's going on, and frankly, as we'll see, for some of them, don't really care. And so something has to change more fundamentally for that to change, for a revival to be possible. And that social change, it could happen tomorrow, it could happen in a few hundred years, and it might not necessarily lead to more people going back to religion. It could lead to some other kind of change that, this is the limits of what we can foresee. It could be some completely different change that I can't even predict here. Okay, so that's your second type of theories. There's a third type of theories about what's going on, right? It's makes it even more complicated. And these are what we call, or what I call, believing without belonging, or spiritual but not religious theories, SBNR theories. So in contrast to the second type, the stage of decline framework, scholars in this third framework their focus is a bit different. They focus not necessarily on the declining institutional expressions of religious affiliation, beliefs, practices, but rather they're looking at how religion and spirituality have changed in our society. So they don't necessarily see it as a decline, they see it as a shift, as a change. Rather than narrowly defining and measuring religion against conventional institutional markers, such as church attendance or communal-orientated religious activities, the Believing Without Belonging framework stresses ongoing private spirituality amongst individuals, even if they're doing it away, or at least a large number of them are doing it away from kind of traditional religious groups. For example, this can include a belief in God, a supernatural being or higher power, belief in an interconnected natural world and universe, belief in some form of afterlife, prayer, meditation, mindfulness activities. Individuals draw on a number of beliefs, rituals, and practices from a variety of sources, some of them linked to religious groups, some of them not, to build and maintain their own kind of personalized faith systems. And many do this away from church doors, away from religious groups. Right? So that's kind of the focus of that third framework. So just kind of giving you a sense of the debates going on. There's obviously, you might have noticed, there's slightly different definitions of religion here, or focuses of what we're studying in terms of research. But as I go through some of the numbers, I'm going to kind of get into the second part of the presentation now, where I want to focus in on that group of people who says they have no religion, look at them a little bit more in detail. And you'll notice that I'll kind of refer back to some of these and kind of maybe test some aspects of these theories as we go along and look at some more numbers. Okay? So are we ready for some more numbers? Yes, yeah. Now, get out. More numbers, that's it, that's my, woo. Okay, more numbers. Okay, so let's look at these people who say they have no religion that make up a quarter of the Canadian, or roughly a quarter of the Canadian population at the current time. There are going to be numbers, but I've also got some interview data too, so I'll give a few examples of them talking about their own non-religious experiences as well. I think I can give you a break from the numbers too. Okay, so they say they have no religion, but do they actually, that being said, do they have some contact with religious groups? Do they attend religious services, maybe regularly? You know, what's the rate of, amongst those who say they have no religion, who are here again in black, so black columns is those who have no religion, how many maybe attend religious services irregularly despite the fact that they say they have no religion? So this is data again from 2015. That frequency in the last year, you were asked respondents, how often did you attend religious services of any type, of any variety? Yellow bars are those who have a religious affiliation, just for comparison purposes, and black is those who have no religion. And what you can see is that there's a very small percentage of those who say they have no religion who attend religious services regularly. They do exist. There are some who, attend religious services regularly, maybe from one faith group, maybe from multiple faith groups, but don't feel the need to identify with one specific group. But they're not the big chunk of religious nuns. There's another proportion, about 16% of those who say they have no religion, who will attend irregularly. So the once a year, twice a year is probably, especially amongst those from an originally Christian background, you're talking about the big holidays like Easter or Christmas, or maybe we'll attend once in a while with a family member or just for their own sake. But the big chunk of those who say they have no religion are having very little to no contact through religious services with faith groups. 82% say they don't attend religious services at all. Okay, so that's kind of like the what I call like the group practice indicator, right? Like how much they attend religious services. But what about maybe the more personalized indicator of like kind of faith or religious activities? Okay, religious nuns for the most part don't attend religious services, but maybe do they pray at home? Do they meditate? Do they have some kind of personalized spiritual or religious practice more on their own rather than in a group? Well, that question was asked in the 2015 General Social Survey as well by StatsCan. And the answer is, for the most part, no. Again, there are some that do, and it's important to mention them. I don't want to forget them. You've got about 10% who say they have personal religious or spiritual practices, notably prayer or meditation, at least once a week. So about 10% of those who say they have no religion. There's a certain percentage that have them less frequently, but a few times or at least once a year. But you're looking at 79% of those who say they have no religion say, nope, whatever I'm doing, I'm not defining it as a religious or a spiritual practice. Okay? And again, in yellow, for comparison purposes, is your rates of those who are religiously affiliated. You got about a third who are not at all as well, right? Just because they identify religion doesn't necessarily mean they have personal or group practices. But you have higher rates amongst those who are affiliated that do have kind of regular forms of prayer, meditation, religious and spiritual practices on their own. So good so far? Yeah? All right. What about beliefs? Okay, so don't really attend religious services for the most part. Not many have more kind of personal religious or spiritual practices, but maybe they still believe in God or a higher power or in the life after death or in an afterlife. Some do. You're looking at about almost a third of those who say they have no religion who say, yes, I have these beliefs. Much higher rate, obviously, of those who are religiously affiliated. Interestingly, not all of them. And this is a phenomenon studying the Quebec context. There's a much higher rate in Quebec who identify as Catholic, but have no, not even some of the most basic beliefs that you would identify with Christianity. It's purely a cultural identity for them, and are complete atheists outside of that. Okay, so believing without belonging. It does exist amongst those who say they have no religion, but it's not everyone who has no religion who also believes without belonging. Some of the scholars I read, talking scholars about Grace Davy, Nancy Ammerman, get the impression from their work that it's everyone who says they have no religion, they still have beliefs, it's all happening outside of religious groups. There's a portion that do, and they're important to study and important to look at and important to understand, but it's not at least for these beliefs, it's not the big chunk of those who say they have no religion. 2/3, roughly, don't believe in God or a higher power amongst those, the black group, the no religion, and don't believe in life after death. Okay, so if they don't believe in those things, what do they believe in? How do they see the world? And this is where I'm going to give you a bit of a break from the numbers. I want to give you a few kind of interview quotes, experiences of people we met, especially in that Pacific Northwest Cascadia study, people talking about religious nuns, people who say they're non-believers, but talking about some of the ways they understand the world, how they see it. And there's diversity amongst this group. It's not like everyone believes in science. Some do. But there's also a lot of different ways of understanding the world amongst that group who doesn't necessarily believe in God or a higher power. So I'll give you first an example of Jaden, who's a young adult woman from the Seattle area. So we interviewed people in BC, Washington, Oregon, and we didn't see a huge difference in a lot of these testimonies between Canada and the US, so I'm using a few from the US to kind of illustrate what I want to show you here. And I want to use a quote from Jaden to kind of show you what I'm talking about when I'm talking about non-belief amongst those who say they have no religion. So Jaden says, I've struggled with trying to believe in God for a long time because my parents believe really strongly in God, and a lot of people possibly do. It's just it just never really resonated or made logical sense to me. So I just logically have not been ever really able to bring that together. And when I try to, it just it drives me crazy. I'm just this does not make sense to me. So kind of Jaden talking about her thoughts on this issue. You can tell the young adults, they use in their sentences a lot. I've tried to train myself not to do that anymore, but it's hard. Okay, so for Jaden, God doesn't make sense. But what does make sense for some of these religious nuns? Well, some have more kind of personalized spiritualities, even though they don't really say they believe in God or a higher power, they do have some kind of spiritual mindset. And Beatrice is an example of this. Beatrice is a young adult from Washington State. And she describes, so quote, I'm very connected, I call it. I'm connected to my higher self and the inner voice, and that's kind of what guides me. And I'm an artist, so I connect to my intuition and kind of the quiet stillness that is within. So I definitely have a lot. I draw every day as a part of kind of meditation. And to focus on the values that I find important, that I've learned from spirituality. And I try and cultivate that and take that out into my job and my school. And when I'm if I'm not feeling well, I definitely use spiritual connection and recognition of the divine and my place in the bigger picture. So I definitely have a spiritual mindset. But Beatrice says she does not have a religion. Other religious nuns will take a more kind of what we call a secular humanist approach, right? So Connor is an example of this. So Connor's in his 50s, he's from the Pacific Northwest region as well, and Connor says, quote, "I don't know what the difference is between irreligious and atheist, but I don't believe in a God and any kind of divine creator. I believe in some kind of set of communal values, which to me is required for a community to live together. I just see, put it this way, the idea of some kind of divine creator seems to me the least likely possibility, or the least likely cause for anything. I just see no reason to believe." Yeah. Other religious nuns will have what we call a more kind of materialistic or scientific worldview. Harry is an example of this. Harry is in his 70s from Portland, Oregon. Harry states, quote, "And I'm getting more atheist as time goes on. It's just about, my belief is the more you learn about, the more we're learning over time about the universe and about physics, chemistry, and the more we learn about what's going on, what we think is going on, the more, in my opinion, it becomes more difficult to believe in some of the things that the church preaches." It doesn't mean that these individuals who kind of hold this more scientific worldview understand every single scientific process that's at play, but they kind of rely on that, or like, well, if I needed to, I probably could, or I have confidence that that scientific method or science can explain what's going on, at least the questions I'm interested in. And then finally, we have some religious nuns who are just not sure at all. And I think coming up is my favorite quote. It's a bit long, and it's a bit all over the place, but that's kind of the point. So Jasmine is a self-identified agnostic. She's a Seattle resident in her early 40s. And she's agnostic, but she says she has a bit of a spiritual bend, and you'll see it come out in her quote. So I'll quote her here. She says, "I don't go to church anymore. I haven't for many years. Well, I go on Easter with my mom because it makes her happy, but I don't even do Christmas anymore, so I'm not even a CNE, Church of England. I'm just an E. I guess just England. I don't know what that means. But agnostic, yes." Maybe. I think it was actually England, but yeah. Anyways. It's hard for me to embrace the label of Christian. That's not really where I'm at. So I think I think I am sort of vaguely spiritual in that I feel like there's more, that there's not just what we can see. I think that there's a lot, there's possibility of all sorts of things, and I'm not discounting the concept of God. I don't know, and I just don't know. If there is a God, like how personal the relationship is, and I have a fascination with things like tarot cards and, the general New Age stuff. Whether or not any of that is true either, I have that same, it could be. It would be kind of nice if it wasn't just we die and then we're dust, I'd like there to be more, but I have a hard time. I'm very skeptical about it all. And I love watching ghost shows and things. And it's like, oh yeah, there could be something, yeah. But then the other part of me is like, oh, they're probably just moving that chair with fishing wire, right? So it's a back and forth. So I can't claim any one specific thought process, right? Jasmine, it's probably maybe one of the first times in this interview that she was trying to articulate what she was thinking, and kind of law of uncertainty, a lot of thinking, kind of trying to develop a thinking about that. And you notice that with a lot of religious nuns, because they don't talk or even sometimes think about these issues, they've never really had to articulate what they think. And so that was part of the project in the Pacific Northwest, was not just to study what they're not, right? Not really religious in some ways, but what they are. Okay, well, what works? How do you understand this world? The next slide I have here is, to what extent maybe if you have some spiritual religious beliefs, how important are they actually in the way you live your life? And what you see is not only do you have lower rates of belief overall amongst religious nuns, but you also have low rates of religious nuns who say that beliefs are all that important in their lives. Unfortunately, the way the question is framed in the 2016 General Social Survey here, it's hard to, the Stats Canada asked the respondent, do you have religious beliefs? And if you do, how important they are? They kind of just ask the salience of belief question, like how important they are. So those who are in the kind of beliefs, religious or spiritual beliefs are not very or not at all important in my life. They're the majority, but it's hard to tell if they still have them and they're just not important, or if they don't have them at all. It's like a distinction I can't make with this data. But the vast majority, 77% of religious nuns say religious and spiritual beliefs are not important in the way I live my life. That compared with, say, 35% amongst those who are affiliated with religion who say that they're not all that important in life, and a much higher rate who say they are amongst those who are religiously affiliated. And all of these kind of trends I'm talking about, amongst younger religious nuns, you see even higher rates of those who don't have beliefs necessarily or don't consider them all that important. The last couple of slides here, don't panic. We're not going to go on forever. There will be an end very soon. The last couple of slides are kind of attempts, this one in particular, is an attempt on my part to kind of create a typology of people who say they have no religion. So I take a bunch of variables that are in these surveys. This survey is from the one that I ran out west in the Pacific Northwest, so in BC, Washington, Oregon, ran it in 2017, had about 1,500 respondents fill out this survey. This is from the British Columbian subsample, so about 750 people. Again, those in black are those who say they have no religion. Those in yellow are those who are religious affiliated, identify with one or any religious group. And based on how they answered a series of other variables, which I'll get into in a minute, try to kind of like group them together. Okay, you're this type of religious nun, you're this other type of religious nun. There's always limits with these typologies. Obviously, in the variables I have access to in the survey, in the thresholds where I draw the line between one group and another, and also the fact that in a survey you can't measure fluidity. So some people might move from one category to the other, but because the survey is a snapshot in time, you can't really capture that. But this is just like an attempt to say, okay, if we were to create these different groups, what percentage of religious nuns would fall into each one? So starting here from the left, I have the kind of subgroup or type of religious nun that I call the involved secular. So this is someone who says they have no religion, they usually don't believe in God or higher power of any kind, and they are active in atheist, humanist, or secularist organizations. Not necessarily active like once a week, but active at least a few times a year, some of them once a week, but take part in these activities. All right, so there are these groups, Atheist International, the Canadian Humanist Association, and they do get together once in a while. They have a larger online network as well. And so I got to ask the question, okay, like how often do you actually take part in these activities in person? And there's only a very small percentage of religious nuns who actually are involved with these groups. So it's not just religious groups that are having trouble getting these people involved. It's also at the other end, the atheists aren't having much success either. There's still some, and it's still important to note. It's also interesting that some of those who are religiously affiliated are also involved with these groups, and there might be some magical collaborations with some religious groups as well, depending on the approach that some of these atheists or non-religious groups take. But most of, at least in British Columbia, and this is something we're getting a sense of that it's probably the case in a lot of other places in Canada, most of religious nuns fall into this second category that I call the inactive non-believer. So that's someone who doesn't believe in God or a higher power, doesn't really do a whole lot about it, right? So that's over half of religious nuns in British Columbia. And again, with the new data that I just got, hopefully I can get a better estimate, at least for young adults across the country. That's also about 10% of those who have a religious affiliation. Then, third category, you have what I call these inactive believers, who do believe in God or a higher power, but again, don't really do a whole lot about it. So that's about 17% of your religious nuns. You then have what I call this SBNR, or spiritual but not religious subgroup. That's about a quarter of those who say they have no religion. These are individuals who self-identify as spiritual, and who might have a few kind of spiritual practices, especially meditation, mindfulness activities seem to be really popular at the moment. And so you're looking at, an important phenomenon of about a quarter of those who have no religion. And then you finally have the 2% of what I call the religiously involved believers, so who attend religious services at least once a month. Now, you've got about 2% of those who say they have no religion, but who aren't quite active, at least with one or many religious groups. And finally, the last kind of point I wanted to make here is that where you find yourself in this typology doesn't usually come out of nowhere. It's usually impacted, not always, but it's often impacted by how you were raised. So this last slide that I've got, again, it's from that Pacific Northwest Social Survey that I ran in 2017. This time it's British Columbia and the states, Washington and Oregon. And in that survey, I asked people, okay, growing up as a kid, think back, way back, between roughly the ages of 5 and 12 years old, on average, how often did you receive some form of religious or spiritual education at school, at home, or at a place of worship? So a really broad definition of what I call religious socialization. All right? And so this is only for those who say they have no religion. And this time I've got 3 types. I was playing around with the typologies. I've got personal believer nuns, who are those who kind of do have a belief in God or higher power, sometimes might irregularly attend religious services or read scripture or other types of religious activities. I have SBNR nuns in the kind of darker gray here, spiritual but not religious. These individuals, not so much belief in God, but belief in kind of connected, mysterious universe. Some are agnostic. A lot do yoga quite often and define themselves as quite spiritual. So that kind of SBNR, middle group. And then in black is the religious nuns, who I call the non-religious, who score low on all of these religiosity and spirituality inquiries. Not much belief, not much spiritual activity, not a whole lot. And what we notice here is that those personal believers, so who do have kind of some links with religion and spirituality, a lot of them got some form of religious socialization as kids. 57% got regularly, so had that religious or spiritual education at least once a week, on average. This is an estimate from their past. Another 21% got some form of education irregularly, so at least a few times a year. All right, so most of them got some contact with religion and spirituality as kids. The SBNRs are kind of in the middle, so about 42% got that regular religious socialization, another 26% less often, but still happened, and about 32% not really, didn't get much education, religious or spiritual, when they were growing up. And then finally, your non-religious, religious nun. Some got, right? These are trends, it's not perfect, it doesn't, it's trends, but there's usually a little bit of everyone that you find in surveys. So just over a third did get a regular religious socialization, but ended up as non-religious as adults. But for the most part, most of them, the 42% at least, didn't get a whole lot or at all as they were growing up. And then about another 22% are irregular. Right? So socialization growing up, this is the sociologist in me that comes through. It doesn't determine what you become as an adult, but it usually has a big impact. You can see this for all social attitudes and behaviors, or most of them, political, affiliation. You all see this kind of impact of socialization. You also see it a lot with religiosity indicators. Those who attend religious services as kids are much more likely to become religious as adults or stay religious as adults. And same goes the other direction. Those who didn't get a whole lot of socialization usually are more likely to say they have no religion and be on the kind of more non-religious end of the spectrum. Okay? All right. So to conclude, 3 main kind of things to take away from the current Canadian religious, spiritual, non-religious landscape. First thing I want to kind of talk about or mention, and it's important to mention, active religiosity is still present in the country. Sometimes you listen to some people and it's like, wow, it's completely gone. It's not. It's present. It's now a minority phenomenon, right? About a quarter of the population. It's diversified. It's been fed a lot by non-Western immigration. In numbers, it's stabilizing now at these lower levels, so I think we're going to keep that kind of core of active religiosity in the country for the years to come, unless demographic patterns shift hugely. Canada suddenly shuts down immigration. It'll be really bad for this group. Not all of religious groups realize this, and it doesn't always come through in their discourse, but they're surviving, or at least a lot of religious groups are surviving from this immigration, and I'm sure a lot of you might be seeing this on the ground, at least for some groups. But it is now what we can call like a substantial but minority phenomenon in the country. Second thing to take away from this is that lived Christianity in the country still looks like a kind of marginal affiliation, right? That's still the big chunk of your Canadian population. It is slowly shrinking amongst younger generations. It's feeding the non-religious group, right? As people kind of move further and further away, you get more and more of their kids that become non-religious, but it's still a big player in Canadian Christianity. So a big chunk of the population still identifies with some form of Christian identity. has some religious beliefs, irregular religious activities, usually surrounding holidays and rites of passage. And I have my photo of the cross on Mont-Royal when I lived in Montreal. I thought it illustrated this well, because in Quebec, not a whole lot of people go to church, but man, if you threaten to take that cross down on Mont-Royal in Montreal, man, like, you get like crazy, crazy editorials coming out of that. So there's that kind of cultural identity, family heritage tie that a lot of people do not want to let go, and sometimes have some irregular activities and some beliefs to back it up as well. And then finally, third thing to take away is that most organized religion indicators are on the decline in the country. If you hear differently, you send them to me. It's pretty straightforward at this point. Most of the indicators we have, at least the way we measure them, we're seeing a decline, especially since the 1960s, and I showed you today since the 1980s. Especially amongst younger generations and populations born in Canada. Okay? And so thus, that's feeding that kind of no religion group that's grown, that's now about a quarter of the Canadian population. And these are demographic factors come into play, that no religion group isn't gaining much from immigration, but it does seem to still be fed by that kind of stages of decline process. So it'll be interesting to see in 2021. My guess is the growth has slowed for this group, but it's still going to be there to a certain extent. Some of these religious nuns have more personalized spiritual beliefs and practices. Often those who had some form of religious socialization as kids, and some don't. Often those who didn't have much of religious socialization as kids. So, you get a whole variety of things going on in Canadian society, and this is something that we can talk about either in the Q&A or in the panel that's coming up after the break of, what does our society look like today? I argue, Joel argues, it looks like basically these different groups coexisting with one another and trying to figure out how to coexist with one another, sometimes successfully, sometimes in a kind of more polarized cultural wars context. And so we can get into that a bit more. I kind of just want to give you a sense of what I see in the data and the kind of main takeaways of what's happening today. So like I said, look for upcoming data. I love data. I'm always producing new information, and I love it, and I love hearing from you guys. If there's anything that you like to know about, shoot me an email, come see me, I'll give you my card. I always like to kind of see what's happening on the ground with you guys, what you're interested in. But in terms of stuff that's coming up, if you want to follow me on Twitter, it's SWILK033. And I've got that Millennial Trends Survey. I'm ready to go. I produce little data graphs I put up on Twitter about once a week for that, so there's some fun information there. And then we've got, like Brian mentioned earlier on, that co-authored book with Joel coming out early next year, hopefully. And then Joel and I will probably be doing a book tour for that next year. Lots of more talks. That'll be exciting. And so, again, if you want some maybe preliminary findings from that, we've already got them. We can send them to you via Twitter. And then, as the book comes out early next year, you'll see Joel and I's Twitter will explode. Be like, yay, the book's out, woo! We'll take a bunch of photos, and we're all proud, and book signings and stuff. So you can follow us along if you want to do that. All right, so thanks, everyone, and looking forward to your questions.